coming together of those, the basis or the parts, then your mind merely label it as book, it as an iPad, it as a table, and so forth. And that is how things exist. And through that, then, through the coming together of that, and then merely labeled by that on the basis of that, as it is, that whatever that object is, through that, then the object arises and perishes. And through that, the objects, some of phenomena or objects bring us suffering, and some of phenomena or objects bring us happiness. Due to that, some of objects harm us, some of objects help benefit us. And so that when it is presented that, and so that is where he is saying, and even that one, the functioning of the relative phenomena is merely imputed by deceptive mind or relative mind itself. Okay, and so so from their point of view, as it has Nagarjuna mentioned, is in his the root of the wisdom, again, similar question being raised, and then Nagarjuna kind of answering that, or and again, even in that same, if things do not exist truly, then that means then there will be if there's no truly existing suffering, cessation, and path, and suffering and origin, and the path and cessations, cessation and the path, then that means there will be no suffering, truth of suffering. There will be no truth of origination. There will be no truth of cessation. There will be no truth of path. And if there is none of them, then how can sentient beings, through the entering the path and practicing, how can they overcome the suffering and cause of the suffering, and then achieve cessation through the path? So to achieve nirvana is not possible. That caution is being because it's not possible. Nothing is possible if they do not truly exist from the other school point of view, because that means they do not exist. And then Nagarjuna says, if it's truly existing, none of them will be possible. Because it's non truly existing, it's all is possible, So he kind of back in the opposite way. The caution, the objection they raise is because if it's not truly existing, none of that will be possible. That is the objection the caution they rise to Nagarjuna. If you say those four truths are not truly existing, then that will means there's no point in sentient beings trying to practice, because they will not be able to achieve nirvana, because there is no nirvana. Because there is no truly existing nirvana, that means there is no nirvana. Then Nagarjuna actually turn it around and say, if it's truly existing, then that will be the case. But because it's not truly existing, then nirvana is possible. Because if it's truly existence, then nothing can be changed. That is how things are. If our mind is deluded, and if that's truly existing, our mind will be deluded all the time. And if our mind is deluded all the time, then there is no way we can overcome that delusions. And there's no way we can achieve nirvana, and nirvana is not possible. But because our mind is not truly existence, the suffering is not truly existence, the origin of the suffering, the karma, the delusion are not truly existence. Therefore, when we change the cause and conditions, that can be changed. By changing cause and conditions, then we can change the suffering, the cause of the suffering. And therefore, we can overcome the suffering and the cause of suffering. Therefore, we can achieve the liberation and nirvana. That is possible. And that is possible if things are not truly existing, if things are not inherent existence. So it is similar kind of caution rise here similarly in that way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In reply, it is unchanging. So, nirvana, but through not understanding, this can be misconceived as arising and perishing just because it possesses deceived truth with regard to that particular false conception. This does not imply that it ceases to exist as an unchanging state. The false conception cannot cause nirvana to no longer exist because other persons cannot make someone else deceive the truth out of his own deceptions. This deception is distorted conception in the mind of someone who has not passed the state beyond sorrow. It is not the deceptive mind of one who has passed beyond the sorrow. Later, the state of nirvana is attained. If the deceptive conception were certain to exist, nirvana would exist as changing, deceptive truth. But since this deceptive conception does not exist in the mind of one who has attained nirvana, nirvana does not exist as changing, deceptive truth. So I think the problems is so when middle way school, when the Madhyamika says everything does not exist truly existence and everything is merely imputed, by a deceptive mind, then there is a misunderstanding, If everything is merely imputed by deceptive mind, then that means they think that, not being able to differentiate the difference between the deceptive mind. Within the deceptive mind, there are some which are valid cognizers and some who are not valid cognizers, even though they all are deceptive. And deceptive in two ways. Some of the mistaken mind, non-valid cognizers, this mistaken mind, they are deceived not only to the appearance, but they are also deceived to the main object of that mind. For example, when someone has some kind of sickness because of to their eyes, then they see the hair falling, you know, even though your hair is not falling, but you see your hair falling, you know. That kind of consciousness is deceived into the main objects. The main object is, even though there is no falling of the hair, but still you see there is falling of the hair, you know. Or in another way, when you see the book, to the mind which perceive the book to be permanent, that is deceiving to the main object, the book, as a permanent. That is totally mistaken mind. But then there are like our consciousness, the I consciousness, which perceive this book as a book. Okay? The I consciousness which perceive this book as a book is still deceptive mind. But it is not deceptive to the main object, the book. So then where is the deception? The deception in appearance, that the book appear truly existence. Do you get it? To our eye consciousness, when you see the book, there's appearance of not only a book, but the book as a existing truly or objectively from its own side. In relation to that appearance, it is deceptive because there is no truly existing book, but to us it appears truly existence. In terms of the, so in the consciousness, we talk about two objects, appearance objects and the main objects that mind grabs. And so in these cases, the main object, the book, then the appearance is the appearance of truly existing book. So in relation to the book, it is a valid cognizance because it perceives it as a book. But in relation to the appearance of truly existing book, then it is a deceptive. And so then when the Madhyamika say, you know, all the phenomena are imputed by deceptive mind, you know, then they think, then not being able to differentiate these two deceptive mind. Within the deceptive mind, there is one who is a valid cognizer and one who is not valid cognizer. And when we say everything is merely imputed by the deceptive mind, we are talking about the valid cognizers. Deceptive mind, but with a valid cognizer. Okay? And so something that has been imputed by a valid cognizer, then that things exist. Something that is imputed by not a valid cognizer, something a totally mistaken mind, and that does not exist, you know, and that has to make distinguish it. But when you don't make that distinguish, again, then you get confused, and then they think you can impute whatever you want. And that is where the problem is coming here. My mind can impute this book as a clock. And your mind can impute this book as an elephant. Then there will be chaos, you know. And so due to not understanding, when you say everything is merely imputed by deceptive mind, but not being able to differentiate two different kinds of deceptive mind. And when it is imputed by deceptive mind, which is a valid cognizer, then you can establish things as existence. But if it is imputed by a distorted mind, then you cannot establish that thing as existence. And so therefore, someone's mind cannot impute someone else something the way, whatever they want. Okay? And not when they don't understand that, then that is the misconception. And then they think everyone can, when they hear everything is merely imputed by the deceptive mind, then they think, oh, then that means even when our distorted mind imputes something, does that exist? And so then that, if that is the case, then it will be totally disorder in the world, totally disorder. And so again, that is not being able to exist, So there we have to make within the deceptive mind, there is a valid cognizer and distorted mind. They both are deceptive mind, but one is valid cognizer and one is distorted mind. And the one which is valid cognizer, when it is imputed by that mind, then object can be established as existent. But when it is imputed by a distorted mind, which is not a valid cognizer, but distorted mind, then you cannot establish as that object to exist. And so when you don't, you cannot make that distinguish, and then there can be a problem. Yeah. So even though in our ignorance, for example, to our ignorance, the object of the ignorance appear to that object as truly existent, and that object is such as truly existent is kind of imputed by the ignorance. But just because that ignorance, that deceptive mind of ignorance imputed that object as truly existent, it cannot establish that as a truly existent. Do you get it? Let's say, okay, there is a ignorance, okay, fundamental ignorance that perceive the object to be truly existent, okay, and to that ignorance, so that objects, that's truly existing objects, is imputed by that ignorance, okay. That mind impute that object as a truly existence, the ignorance. But even though that ignorance impute that object as truly existing, still you cannot establish that object as truly existent, because the mind which imputed that truly existence is distorted mind, not a valid cognizer. That ignorance is not valid cognizer, it's a totally distorted mind. And so therefore, as I already mentioned, when they hear that everything is merely imputed mind, then they think any mind impute anything would exist the way it impute. And if that's the case, that ignorance impute the objects are truly existent, that means there will be a truly existence, And so then Madhyamika makes distinguish. It's not like that. When we say everything is merely imputed, when things exist by merely imputed by the mind, deceptive mind, then you have to distinguish two kind of deceptive mind, distorted deceptive mind and non-distortive, but valid cognizer. And everything that is imputed by the valid cognizer, that can be established as existence, and those which are imputed by the distorted mind, such as ignorance, cannot be established as existent. And so I think there is a confusion that there comes, and that is the differentiation the Madhyamika make to clarify that. Since examining mind and exam object are mutually dependent on one another, if the object is established, the mind too will be non-existence. Therefore, your analysis of non-true existence would be invalid. So the Madhyamika says everything is interdependent and mutually interdependent. And so in that cases, the object that is being examined and the subject that is examining, they are mutually existent by depending on each other's, and because of that, because they are mutually dependent arising, depending on each other's, therefore they cannot be truly existing or inherent existence. If something is inherently truly existent, then that means they don't depend on other factors for their existence. Something that truly or inherently existing means independent existence. That means they don't depend on other factor for its existence. But if it exists on something other factors, then that means it's not truly existing. It means it's not independent existence, inherent existence. And so through that, if the object is not established, the mind too will not be non-existent. Yeah, if there is no objects, then there wouldn't be the mind that that perceive that object cannot be established. And therefore your analysis of non-truly existent would be invalid. And so here, is saying, again, it's the same misunderstanding, if you say the object is not truly existent, then that means there's no objects, because again, they cannot are unable to differentiate that. And if there's no objects, then there is no subject that is analyzing, examining. And if there is no mind which is examining, then how can you say there is a then how can you say there is a there is a mind which is analyzing whether it exists or not exists, or truly exists or not exists, because there is no mind itself that is examining. So you cannot even talk about analysis itself, whether there is truly existing or not truly existing, because to analyze that, you need a mind that examine that, analyze that. And there is no mind because there is no object. And there's no objects because there is no truly existing objects. So that is the kind of misunderstanding, and that kind of question arises. Indeed, because the objects does not truly exist. So here, the answer is saying, we are not saying the object does not exist, but we are saying the object does not truly exist, making the differentiations. The Madhyamika never say object does not exist. They said the object does not truly exist. The mind also, just as object does not exist truly, also the mind does not truly exist. Also the mind does not truly exist. But that does not mean the analysis is invalid, because all analytic mind are spoken of as a conventional consciousness and are said to be dependent upon reasoning, which is accepted in the world. So again, what it is saying is, one, the object and the subject, the mind, the object, which is the object to be examined or perceived by the mind, and the mind, which is perceiver, the perceiving the objects. Those two are dependent, mutually dependent arising. Without objects, there's no subject. Without subject, there's no object. You can only talk about something being subject in relation to object. You can only talk about something object as being object in relation to there is subject. And so that clearly shows that subjects, objects are relative, not ultimate or absolute. If something is ultimate, absolute, truly existing, then it doesn't depend on others. It will be able to exist itself as an object without depending on the subject. It will be able to exist as a subject without depending on objects, but that is not possible. And just like, Nagarjuna explained, everything's, how the actions and person who create actions, how they depend each others. For example, if we say someone a diver, he is a diver, he or she is a diver, or nurse, whatever, teacher. That someone exists as a teacher, as a nurse, as a diver in relation to their job, in relation to their work, the actions, isn't it? He is diver because he drives that actions. She is nurse because of her job, her action, her work, serving the patients in some way. He or she is teachers because of actions of teaching the students. If there is no act of teaching, then he or she cannot be teacher. If there's no act of driving, he or she cannot be driver. If there's no act of helping the patient, he or she cannot be a nurse or doctor. So all of that is, as a nurse, as a doctor, as a teacher, as a diver, everything's in relation to the job or the action they do. Okay? And we can only talk about the actions, driving, in relation to someone there is a driving. If there is no one who is driving, we cannot talk about the action of drive. Do you get it? If there is no one, such as a doctor or nurse, we cannot talk about the act of helping the patients. If there's no teacher, we cannot talk about student being the act of teaching. So again, the actions and the persons who is create action, they are mutually dependent arisings. Due to the act, then we can talk about that as person being that particular one. And we can talk about someone's teacher because of their act of teachings. And we can talk about something as the act as a teaching because there is someone who is teaching. And so that is how mutually existence, and that is a very profound. Normally, when we think of teacher, we don't think, we think there is a teacher by himself or herself. We don't see that the teacher being a teacher exists only in relation to the act of teaching. And same way, when we think of the act of teaching, we think there is an independent teachings, the act of independent teachings, and we cannot see that can be only act of teaching because there is someone who is teaching. And so that is mutual dependent arisings, and that is another unique of the Prasangika view. Everything is mutually dependent arisings. Cause and effect. we can only talk something as an effect in relation to the cause. If there's no cause, we cannot talk about effect. We can only talk about cause in relation to the effect that produced that effect. If there's no effect, we cannot talk about something being a cause. We call it something cause. We can talk about something being a cause because that can produce certain effects, certain results, certain consequences. If there's no consequences, if there's no effect, if there's no result, then we can talk something as being a cause. So cause, to exist as a cause, it depends on the result, the effect. Something to exist as a result, then it has to depend on the cause. You know, we can only talk about something as a result or effect in relation to the preceding cause. And then we can apply that to everything's, you know, everything's. That is the kind of mutual dependent arisings. And so all these phenomena, where it says art and all this spoken in conventional consciousness are said to be dependent upon reasoning, which is accepting the world, you know. When we do deeper analysis, we cannot really find within the basis, but at the same time, we have to accept there is a book. We have to accept there is a table. We have to accept there is an iPad. We have to accept there is the light. Because that is how we are accepted and function in the world. You know? Otherwise, so what it means is those things does not exist as itself from its own side, objectively, ultimately, but they exist by depending on many causes and conditions and the way we function in the world. You know, we says, you know, someone who ever came, they with some syllables and then words and then sentence, then you started to write them, which makes the sentence, and you bring all this together, and then with the paper you print it or write it, and then we call in our world, we call it a book, and that's how we accept as a book. The way it is in the world. But if you really say what is book, where is book, within each part we cannot find it. But at the same time, we have to say this is book, because in our world, that's how we accept it. In coming with this, all these parts that make as a book, and then we say, oh, whoever came out with this idea first time, whoever invented, you know, the book, and say, you know, they decided to say this is a book, and then after that we all call it as a book. And that is how book is. So according to that is what, but it does not exist by its own side. Yeah, I think we will have a short break. Okay. So I think going to discuss a little bit about the dependent arising, because that is one of the important reasonings, reasoning or logic, to understand how things are inherently exist in ultimately existence. So when we talk about dependent arising or dependent originations, all the different Buddhist schools have this concept of dependent arising, dependent originations. All the Buddhist schools have that concept, But in terms of understanding of what dependent arising is, even though they all say they all accept dependent arising or dependent origination, but then when you talk about them, they get a gross level and subtle level. So when we talk about dependent arising, dependent originations, we can talk about in terms of, let's say, conditioned phenomena, just as, let's say, a book, okay? This book is dependent origination, dependent arising, because it depends on its cause and conditions. It is dependent on the paper, which is made out of trees, most probably. And the tree is depending on its seeds and many other causes that give, the fertilizers, the water, the heat, light, everything that, and the paper. So it depends on the paper. It depends on the book exists by depending on the paper, depending on the ink that is needed to print the letters, the words, and then put together all of that, and the author, whoever write it. So depending on all these causes and conditions, the book is being produced. The book exists by depending on all these causes and conditions. That one, all the Buddhist schools accept, okay? All the Buddhist schools have that same understanding. The book is dependent arising by depending on its cause and conditions. And not only book, all the conditioned phenomena, all the conditioned phenomena. And I think that I think science also come to same conclusions, that the concept of dependent arising, dependent origination, which has kind of promoted very strongly by Buddha, more than that has been spoken much more about that in recent times, not for a long time. As with these technologies and as they see how everything is go to smaller particles, go smaller, and they can see how it functions, and then how everything is by depending on so many other particles, matters, and energies, and how things are being produced, and that there is more and more understanding of that, how everything is kind of dependent arising, dependent origination, and there is more kind of talk more about in that from that point of view. Then not only that, then it also says, not only the book is dependent on its cause and conditions, the book is also dependent on its parts. To each of this book is dependent on each of the pages. If I take away those pages, then it wouldn't be the Guide to Bodhisattva way of life, So it depends on the cover, each of the book inside, each of the subject matter that is written into each of this page, and all of that makes it book. So not only depend on preceding cause and condition, which is that needed before the being being produced, but now even book, this one depends on its parts to exist as a book. And again, I think when it comes to growth, such as the book, also all Buddhists will accept that this book is dependent on its parts, all the Buddhist schools. But when you go subtle and subtle, and then when it comes to the most subtle matter, so subtle that you cannot break into two anymore. When it comes to that, then there is a difference between some Buddhist schools. Some of the schools, Bhavasika and Sotandrika, they believe there is a partless, very small matter. Okay. So therefore, then in that partless matter, then it doesn't depend on its part because there's no part. And they say that smallest partless matter coming together makes the growth, physical matters. But there is this very small, it's so small that you cannot break into any more two. So that is why they're called partless. Okay. So then the other schools, such as Mind-Only schools and Madhyamika school, they say even that smallest one is not partly, it's still part. Then they talk about part in terms of, it doesn't have part in a sense, it cannot break into two because it's too small, but still they say there's a part, there is the part which is the west side of the part, west side of that particle, east side of that particle, north side of that particle and west side of that particles. And then they have, if there is no side, then if you add another part, then it cannot grow because it will be going in the same places. But because there is a part which touches this side and doesn't touch this side, south and west, then another particle this way, and another particle comes this way, north side, another particle that same smoke comes south, and then it started to build up, and then that becomes how bigger and bigger, and then grows. Then it becomes gross where our eye can see it, or even with technologies. If there is no part which touch this side and which doesn't touch other side, then it will be, there is no way they can come together and become a bigger. That was one of the logic that they used. So therefore, even the smallest one, there is a part which is west part of that, south part of the side of the part, and that. So that is still, therefore, is not a partless. And so therefore, there is no, conditioned phenomena which is partless. So then when it comes to the schools, then within the different Buddhist school, there is slightly different here now. Okay. Then the Madhyamika, the Nagarjunas, they said not only is dependent on its parts, but it is also dependent on the mind that impute to the objects as it is. For example, when the book is being first produced, whoever came out with this idea of making a book for the first time doesn't have this book, but this idea of printing or writing, and then your ideas, your views, your thoughts into a syllables in write, and that, and then before someone came with some idea of to call it as a book, before someone impute as a book, if someone will say, can you bring a book? We have no idea what you are talking about. If someone said, oh, the book is nice, the book is not nice. The book is big, small, good, bad. Or can you bring the book? Or the book is lost. We have no idea. No one will able to function. It cannot function. No one know what they are talking about. Nobody. And so if a book exists from its own side as a book, then even before someone says it's a book, and when someone say, hey, let's book a book, we should be able to understand and be able to communicate what you are talking about, but it's not the case. So once it come everything together, then whoever invented that object, then they decided, I'm going to call this as a book, whatever you call this. Someone came with this, phone with sudden, and they decided, oh, I'm going to call iPhone. Before that, if someone said iPhone, nobody really know what you are talking about. Someone said, bring you an iPhone, even if it's lying there, the technology is there. Nobody will know how to. And so the iPhone doesn't exist as an iPhone from its own side, but the iPhone exists as an iPhone on the basis of all the technology and bring together, function in a certain way. Then whoever invented, they decided to call it iPhone. Once their mind label, impute, it is an iPhone. From that moment, then everyone's begin to connect it as an iPhone. When I see it as an iPhone. I relate it as an iPhone. Before that, it might be lying on there. I might not see it as an iPhone. Something there, some object, but it's not an iPhone. And so that is how in all objects, the basis for the iPhone is there. Even someone calls it iPhone, it has the functioning. They have put all this, the engineer has put all this kind of engine together and to work those different functionings. And the basis for iPhone is there, but iPhone is not there before someone imputed as an iPhone. And the moment someone impute, I'm going to call this new object that I have invented as an iPhone. From that moment, that person also responds and relate as an iPhone, and then other people also relate an iPhone, and then they see it, and then we can, and so, but before that, nobody relate it as an iPhone. The basis is there, but not an iPhone. The basis for iPhone is there. It's interesting, isn't it? When the Nagarjuna say everything's imputed by your mind, it is not saying the basis to call iPhone is not there. Okay, but what it is saying is the so-called iPhone is merely imputed on the basis that has certain functionings. Even that is the case, normally when you see it to our mind, it doesn't appear that iPhone is just merely imputed on the basis of that, particular functioning, particular engine, technologies, engine put together for certain functionings. It seems like it was iPhone from the very beginning. It doesn't feel like so-called iPhone was just imputed by someone's mind to that technology. And so if we do that, then we can apply that to all phenomena same way. So then the object to exist as that object, it depends on the mind to impute it. The mind to impute it, And that that is where the specialty of the Nagarjuna account, why everything is merely imputed by the mind. And when we say merely imputed by the mind, the iPhone does not exist as an iPhone from its own side. There's a basis for the iPhone, but the so-called iPhone is merely imputed. Same in the book. Before someone came with this idea, I'm going to call this the first person who ever invented, going to say, I'm going to call this a book. There is the basis for the book, but it's not a book. And the moment that person decided, oh, I'm going to call these new inventions, these new objects as a book, from that moment, then the book exists. And that book is merely imputed. Before that, there is a basis for the book, but not book. And that will be the same with all the different objects. So can you understand when they say is merely imputed? Sometimes because we think when you use this merely imputed, then we think, oh, there is nothing there. There's nothing I can touch on. Do you get it? Nothing, that there is no external object. We are not saying, they do not say there's no external object that you can hold on. But before you impute it as a book, it was not a book. It is the basis for the book, but it is not a book. Same with the iPhone, same with the table, same with the iPad, same with the cup, everything's light. And so then so then we can see how everything is merely imputed. And so we have to understand that, because if we don't understand that way, then it feels like we are rejecting the external object itself. Do you get it? It's not negating the external object itself that I can touch, that I can open, I can read. But the so-called book, on the basis of that is merely imputed. So-called table is merely imputed on the basis of the legs, 4 legs and upper part and side part coming together, and then whoever invented decided to call it table, and that the mind label it as a table, and that is how table started to exist from that moment on. The basis was before someone labeled as a table, but it was not a table. So the table is merely imputed on the basis of the table. And so that is, and that depending arising by depending on its mind to impute, that become more subtle, And in order to have a really understanding of emptiness, then we need to have this understanding of depending arising on the basis of merely imputed by the mind. Because understanding of depending on its cause and condition is much more gross level. Things exist, things existing on its cause and conditions. That understanding is much more, that understanding help us to lead closer to the understanding of emptiness, but understand that itself is not understanding emptiness. It's a much, much gross level. That one, all the Buddhists, schools can have that understanding. And we have that understanding. When I see the plant, I see that it is dependent on its seeds. I see it is dependent on water, fertilizers, light, heat, whatever it needs. We have that understanding. That understanding is not so subtle and so difficult. Whereas really understanding emptiness is much more subtle and difficult. So in order to have a correct understanding of emptiness, then that's where, we need to have that understanding of dependent arising in the term of depending on its mind, merely imputed by mind, depending on that mind that impute, the book does not exist as a book from its own side. The table does not exist as a table from its own side. The iPhone does not exist as an iPhone from its own side, but merely all objects exist independent on the mind that impute or label as that object in relation to the basis coming together. And then, as we just went through some of the verse here, then also it talked about the mutual dependent arising. Again, this is very, not all the Buddhist schools have the same understanding of mutual dependent arisings. Some of the other schools, they think first there is the objects and then there is the subjects that precede the objects. They say there is the cause first and then the effect later, So the result depend on cause, but cause does not depend on result. That is what they say. The subject, the mind perceiving the book, will depend on the book, but book not depend on receiving the book, the subjects, But in a Nagarjuna middle way schools, they say it is mutual, dependent arisings. They exist, the mind who is perceiving the object and the object. They depend on each other. One cannot exist without depending on others. And so we already give same with the cause and effect, same with the object and the subject, the mind, and we all alter the actions and the person's, what you call, I don't know in English word, in Tibetan is chabapo, like the person who create the actions, action doer. Can you? I don't know. So action and action doer, they depend on each others, and then all others, small and big. You cannot talk something small without big. You cannot talk about something big without small. So small and big, they are mutually dependent on others, good and bad, positive, negative, harmful, harmful and beneficial. And with that, what we understand, when we understand that, then we have better understanding of how things are relative and not absolute. And when we have that understanding, it helps us when we come into contact with different objects. When I see something, beautiful objects, pleasant object, which become the object of my attachments. There's sense of absolute beautiness, from objectively, absolute beautiness from objectively. And the moment you believe that, then your mind has strong grasping, clinging, and wanting that object. But if you understand, it's just a relative. There's no absolute beautiness from its own side. Instead, it's coming from subjective side, mind. Then you know, oh, I just have to change my mind. I don't need that object because it's coming from my mind. Instead of feeling, I need the object. When you see the beautiness, absolute from objective side, then that is what you really feel you need that one to give you a joy, satisfaction. But once we understand there's no absolute beautiness from objective, it's more from your subjective, your mind, then we say, oh, if I can change my subject, the mind, I can have satisfaction, joy inside without having that object. Or I can say, oh, it is only beautiness in only relation to this. If it's in relation to another one who is much more beautiful, is not a beauty at all. And then again, you have less attachment. You see this is so nice, and you bring much more 10 times nicer one, and you lose your attachment to here, isn't it? Someone give you let's say 6, 7 iPhone, and you get attached, and then someone comes 11 one. You want that one? Oh, that one sounds better, But so in relation to that, in relation not having that, it looks nice. But when you in relation to that, then it is not as great. And so when you see in relation that it's not an absolute beautiness, it is on relative, and then you can see there's less attachment, and that can be to any object in terms of anger, and object of our anger. We see someone, we get angry because we feel that person is absolutely bad. Absolutely bad, But what is bad? Is there absolute badness? Again, it's a relative, It's such a relative. Something that you feel bad before, after 10 years, you might feel that is good. Something you feel good about, something about good, after 10 years, you might change your mind and you feel it's bad. Not to talk about other people's opinion different. Something I feel this is a nice, someone just might say is not a nice. Who is right, who is wrong? It's interesting. Sometimes we feel like we are right. Who is right, who is wrong? It's difficult. It helps us to be less judgmental. It helps when we have that understanding. We don't become so fixed with our idea of righteousness. When we have this, when you don't understand the relative, then we have this, when we have this feeling of absolute, then absolute right, absolute wrong, absolute good, absolute bad. And when we have that kind of kind of feeling, then we can become very, very, very judgmental and feel very righteous and all of that, But if we don't have that concept of absolute but more relative, then everything's in relation to something. Something bad in relation to someone who is better. That could be good in relation to someone who is much more worse. Okay. Example, many people, and we failed, for example, George Bush was bad when he was in president. I think a lot of our mind have changed now. He seems a nice guy now. And that just shows how relative it is. Why, in compared to our present president, he looks a decent, nice guy. In relation to someone else, he doesn't look so decent. He doesn't look so nice and kind. In relation to now, he looks much more kind, compassionate. And that could be, we could change our view even about this one in the future, who knows? When George Bush was the president, we never thought that you will start liking them. You would start liking him, but it changed. A lot of people started liking him, which they didn't like him when he was in that position. And then there were a lot of people who didn't like Obama when he was in that state, on the other side. But there are a lot of people now who see him in a different, now they have different opinion about him. Many people's mind have changed. Because even though they don't agree with a lot of his policy, but he was decent, compassion, empathy, caring, and all of that. So their perception about him changed. And that is the things, everything is so relative. So relative. Someone can look very bad in relation to someone who is much more better, and someone can look much good in relation to someone who's much more worse. So we can talk about someone bad or good only in relation to something else. And so that helps us to, our mind to be more flexible instead of being fixed. At the moment, when we don't understand and when we don't fully understand the relativity, and when we really grasp absolute, then our mind becomes very fixed. Very fixed. Very fixed, very narrow, very judgmental. And that brings a lot of suffering, pain to ourselves and to the society. On the other hand, if we see all of them are relative, our minds start to become less tight, less fixed. Because I'm not talking this is the absolute good or bad. It can be bad in relation to something. It can be good in relation to something. It can be so-so in relation to something. And there's possible of all of them in relation to different. So your mind is much more open, much more flexible, much more relaxed, not so uptight. And when your mind started to become more flexible, more relaxed, more open, definitely, it will bring much more changes in your life, in dealing with your emotions. And through that, in dealing with others. And through that, how we contribute in the society that we live in. If my mind is so fixed, so narrow, so uptight, I can easily get in the kind of conflict with someone who has different ideas, different views. I can start to have very strong conflict. I can start to argue. I can start to feel negative about that person just because we have different view and my view is very fixed, narrow. But if my mind is more open, because I say relatively, and I say, well, no, I don't agree with that, but I can understand that, where that come from, where that view come from. And from one perspective, it makes sense. From one perspective, it doesn't make sense, but from one perspective, it makes some certain sense. You started to have some understanding of that person and their view. Doesn't mean you agree with them totally, but you can understand where it comes from and why they feel that way, why they have that views from the relative point of view. And also just having, while I believe this is truth, but I could be wrong. Instead of feeling I can't be wrong. Instead of feeling I can't be wrong because the evidence are there. That's how we feel. The other side is feeling similar way. They feel they can't be wrong. They are absolutely, because they think they have the evidence. And we rely on different evidence, different sources of evidence. And I think it really helped us to, while we can have different opinion, different views, and where we can try to follow our own views and our own ideas at the same time without clinging, grasping so tightly and feeling this is absolute. Once we have become that, then it's very hard to have a conversations, good conversation, open conversation with people who have opposite view. And without that kind of conversations, open conversation, how we are going to come together and overcome the conflict, overcome the different view, different ideas, it's not possible. But if you don't have that fixed ideas, you can have a nice conversation with people who can have a totally different opinion, view on everything. And you don't agree with them, but you can understand them. You can understand them. You can be friend with them. True friend. True friend. And so when you have, when our mind is more open in that, and then, if we don't have bad feeling to each other, then it's easy to discuss and easy to talk about it. And because we don't take it too personal, we just try to hear different views, but without taking it too personal. And the moment we take it personal, then it started to become, more negative. And then our conversation does not go well. Once we started to feel that feeling, there's some kind of negative feeling with each other's, then they can't be, it's hard to have honest conversations. And even there is honest conversations, there is already kind of defending of each other's. And so your mind is already kind of close. You already have made your mind to a certain degree, So I was, while I was talking, we were talking about the mutual dependent arisings, and then how through that, how we understand everything is relative and not absolute, and how that understanding of non-absolute and relative can help us in terms of to make our mind more open, more flexible, less narrow, less rigid, and that kind of mind help us not only to have more peace, because even someone's someone express totally opposite view and idea of ourselves, we don't take it so rigidly, so personally, instead we can just understand from relative point of view, just saying, everything relative is their point of view, is they have right to be their point of view, I have right to have my point of view, and we all have right to have our point of view. Sometimes we can become so rigid and we scream when we are not allowed to express our speech. We think they are taking our freedom of speech. And then other side, we don't want them to have the freedom of speech, because we believe those should be suppressed, because we believe that is harmful or whatever. But, and that is our view. From their point of view, our speech is harmful. They want to suppress our speech, because from their point of view, our speech is harmful. And they truly believe that is harmful. And so it is interesting, when we really kind of really look at, how our mind become biased, how our mind become biased. And our mind become biased because of, on the basis of that kind of believing that kind of absolute. So it's important to relate how this understanding affect our state of mind, and how that state of mind affect our emotions. If we can if we see the connection, then we see why it's important to study and to learn and to understand. As I always mention, it's not just a philosophy, it's very much related with our experience, Then we understand the importance of that. So anyway, I think because I think maybe we have been going through some of the verses sometime, just going through the verses, and sometimes I guess we don't have time to really go in detail about how those understanding or misunderstanding, how it relates with our experience in our everyday life and our emotions and that. And I think sometimes it is important to really understand that. So we don't see it is just kind of some kind of argument between two schools of thoughts. We think, oh, it is an argument too, so why we need to study that? Why is it important? Let them have a argument themselves. What is the point of for me to study their argument? Because correctly understanding, not correctly understanding, has a strong impact in to our mind. And through that kind of, by studying their argument, we begin to have more and more deeper and more subtle understanding of the subject matter in terms of dependent arising, in terms of emptiness. Okay, so we can do the dedications.